Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Iris Caldwell. I'm from the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where we facilitate the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group. And I'm excited to welcome you to today's Research Roundtable, where research meets application across the energy, transportation, and pollinator nexus. And this concept was developed with our partners at Southern Company and our other members of our planning team to really help us highlight ongoing research that relates to pollinators, but also has implications on energy and transportation landscapes. And it builds upon something that we tried a couple of years ago with the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group. At that time, we called it the Science Roundtable, but it was the same concept of bringing together researchers and practitioners to help think about applying the best available science to the work that we're doing on the ground. So with today's webinar, we are focusing on pollinator habitat establishment and first-year management. And we felt this was a particularly appropriate topic to kick things off in terms of thinking. Many of you are in a position of looking ahead at this next year, maybe in the process of kicking off your own habitat projects or thinking about vegetation management activities. And so we thought this would be a welcome topic today to start off our Research Roundtable webinar series. So I'm going to take a moment and let my co-hosts introduce themselves, Claire and Ashley.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Ike. I work for Southern Company, and I manage our company-wide pollinator initiatives and research projects. So I'm excited to be a part of this event today, and I hope that everyone enjoys it.
My name is Ashley Bennett. I'm with the Electric Power Research Institute, and in EPRI, my program focuses on research, in particular vegetation management and pollinator research on rights of way.
Great, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge Caroline Hernandez and Claudia Kuklinksa at University of Illinois, Chicago, who are helping everything run smoothly behind the scenes and have been also a part of planning for today's event. So thank you to them. As far as just some additional context before we get started, as I mentioned, this is part of a 4-part webinar series where we're going to be looking at a variety of different topics, again, at that pollinator, energy, and transportation nexus. And our objectives for this webinar series is to, 1, highlight current research that will be hopefully relevant to much of the work that you all are doing, and also provide a forum for us to talk about other related research, either past or current or future, and hopefully identify research needs, research gaps, and spark some collaborative conversations around how we can work together to advance the research as well as the work that's happening on the ground. I'm going to turn things back to Claire to go over a couple of housekeeping items.
Thank you, Iris. Just a few quick reminders here from a housekeeping perspective. Please, you are all muted upon entry, but please keep yourself muted throughout this webinar and video off, except during the breakout discussions. Please also update your Zoom name to include your organization. And there's been some conversation in the chat about this already, but you can do that by going to your box, your tile, and clicking the 3 dots in the little blue square to then select rename and enter your full name and organization. This will be really helpful, especially during the breakout sessions. We can all know who is in the room, as well as know how to address each other. If you are having any technical issues, please contact Claudia Kuklinkska in the chat box. Please submit all other questions or comments in the chat box. We are recording this presentation and we'll share afterwards. And we are also planning to, in the event that we run out of time from a question and answer perspective, we do plan to compile all of the questions from the chat box and send out a Q&A to participants. Next slide. Okay, well, for today's agenda, we have our webinar broken up into 2 parts.
The first half or first part, we're going to have 4 lightning round research talks that we're really excited about. And in the second half, we're going to break into smaller groups. And as Iris said, we're going to have the opportunity to ask questions, talk about research needs, and hopefully brainstorm future collaborative research opportunities. After those breakouts, we're going to come back together and we're going to have some recaps from our breakout leads, and then we'll close. Next slide. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce our 4 speakers. We are really excited. I'm really excited to hear our presentations today from our speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Logan Rowe. Logan is a conservation associate from Michigan State University, and today he's going to be telling us about some of his research on native plant selection and how native plants can support pollinators as well as other natural enemies. Our next speaker is going to be Justin Meissen. Justin is a research and restoration program manager for the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Justin is going to be highlighting some of the research they've done there on seed mix design and first-year management practices of native habitat. Our third speaker today is going to be Cheryl Daniels. Cheryl is a senior project manager from Davey Resource Group, and Cheryl will be talking about some of her work in evaluating native habitat along road rights-of-ways in Ohio. And our last speaker today is going to be Aaron Feggestad. Aaron is a senior ecologist at Stantec, and Aaron's going to be telling us about a solar project where he's been comparing the establishment of turf versus prairie pollinator habitat, looking at establishment as well as pollinator attractiveness. So our very first speaker today is Logan, and Logan is going to be talking about plant selection to support pollinators, and I missed the rest of in the Great Lakes region, Logan. So we're really excited to hear your talk, and thank you for joining us today. So Logan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sorry, give me just a second. I'll get the PowerPoint back up.
I think I might have accidentally done that. Sorry.
No, that's okay. There you go.
Great. So as you know, my name's Logan. I'm a zoologist with Michigan Natural Features Inventory and Michigan State University Extension. My background is in entomology, but it's sort of always been at the intersection of entomology and habitat restoration and conservation. So I'll be talking again about some of the work that I did as a graduate student at Michigan State University. Okay, so I wanted to start off by just going over a few things that I think are relatively consistent across the Great Lakes region in terms of selecting wildflowers for habitat conservation work. And these are actually published in Rufus Isaacs et al. 2009. First off is local adaptation of plant species. As we all know, native plants are regionally adapted to their habitat and to their climate. And in terms of maintaining sort of that genetic structure locally, it's good to include plant material in this conservation program work that is sort of from the area originally or natively from the area. Habitat permanency, the use of native perennials in habitat programs, whether it be via seeds or plugs, help ensure long-term viability of the habitat. Perennials, of course, come back every year, which will minimize the need to do interseeding or reseeding down the road. In terms of supporting the greatest number of pollinators and other beneficial insects that I'll talk about today, it's important to increase native plant diversity sort of as much as possible. Bees are unique. They have unique relationships with a variety of different plant species, and many of these are species-specific relationships. And in order to recruit all of that diversity in terms of pollinators and other beneficial insects, it's important to increase that diversity at the plant species level as well. And lastly, minimize reoccurring costs. So I sort of mentioned this with habitat permanency, but once these things get established in their habitat, they tend to stay there. And so reoccurring costs down the road essentially come to managing the habitat in however you develop a management program, whether that's burning or mowing or herbicide use, all of the above. It's easier to manage perennial habitat than annual habitat. So I wanted to first share some work that came out in 2007 and 2008 out of Rufus Isaacs and Doug Landis's lab, looking at different wildflower species and their attractiveness to both pollinators and natural enemies. So you'll see these images throughout the presentation: bees and lady beetles. And I condensed this work to show the most attractive plant species in each of these studies, as well as their bloom period. That work resulted in this extension bulletin, which is available via a PDF or printable version. And it's a really useful tool because it provides all of these species that they studied, as well as their bloom phenologies and their relative attractiveness to natural enemies and bees using this good, better, best framework. I really like this work because it's based on data collected in the field. And this is sort of the groundwork for the research that I did in 2016 to 2018. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about that work. At 3 different sites across the state of Michigan, up in Traverse City, some in mid-Michigan, and then southwest Michigan, we looked at 54 different plant species that were adapted to dry mesic sandy soils. And we essentially tested them for their attractiveness to pollinators and natural enemies using this randomized garden block design. You can see in the photos on the bottom left from above and on the bottom right. Each week we would go out and we would collect bees and natural enemies from all of these single species plots. And we separated the data into these 3 bloom periods: early bloom, middle bloom, and late bloom. A number of these species were previously tested in the work that I shared a slide ago, and 4 of them were recommended to us by beekeepers that we work with in the state of Michigan, 2 of which are non-native: spotted knapweed and birdsfoot trefoil, and the other 2 that are native, Pelosum and virginianum, both 2 species of mountain mint. So some of these slides are going to be a little bit difficult to go through in such short time, but I'm including them so that folks can go back to this presentation and look at the information in a little bit more detail. But this is the 54 plant species that we studied, their peak bloom periods, as well as their entire bloom duration throughout the field season, including their peak bloom periods highlighted in this orange color. We also collected plant establishment data on each of these species from 2014 to 2017. And what you see here are all the plant species separated by bloom period and ranked by the number of stems that showed up in each of the single species plots. And so each of these plots started off as 3 plugs in the summer of 2014. And as you can see here, by the summer of 2017, and some of the plots, or for some of the plant species, were all the way up to 100+ stems per plot. So this is really informative in that it provides a baseline of information for plant selection in the Great Lakes region, in the sense that you can select certain plant species that are more likely to get established and spread once established. So the next 3 slides are going to look somewhat like this. And each slide is going to be associated with a particular bloom period. So we'll go early, middle, late. I'm actually showing both the attractiveness to wild bees and the attractiveness to natural enemies of crop pests. So things like soldier beetles that eat aphids, lady beetles, all of the families are listed here for both wild bees and natural enemies. And so if you're interested in supporting particular groups, this information can sort of help with that. But I'm just gonna go through and highlight some of the most attractive native plant species for each of these bloom periods. Think of these as sort of my recommendations to include in programs based off of the research that I did. Let's just get them all on the screen first. So these 5 plant species: yarrow, common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, roundleaf ragwort, and prairie cinquefoil were the 5 most attractive plant species in the early bloom period. And so each of these has this, either a bee or a lady beetle or both. And that's just showing what's primarily driving this attractiveness. So if you're interested in supporting both of these groups of plant species, you can use this information to select those. Or if you're focused primarily on supporting pollinators, which of course is the topic of this webinar, you can see what plant species are most attractive to bees. In the middle season, we have Monarda fistulosa, Solidago nemoralis, Pygnanthemum pilosum, Hypericum prolificum, and Pygnanthemum virginianum. These were the 5 most attractive plant species during the middle season to both of these groups. You can see here that both of these mountain mints, both of the Pygnanthemum species, the relationship is being driven by natural enemies. And so again, if you're particularly interested in supporting the bees, then you will have to dig into this research a little bit more to pull out those species. Of course, as an entomologist, I recommend selecting plants that support both groups. They both provide really important ecosystem services. But the figure above can sort of guide you through that plant selection process for species in the Great Lakes region. And then the late season plants, we have Solidago speciosa, Coreopsis tripteris, Oligeron rigidum, Solidago ginsea, and Sympiotrichum syricum. And again, the story is the same. These are the 5 most attractive plant species to both wild bees and natural enemies during the late season bloom period, based off of the research that I did in 2016 and 2017. One thing I want to point out, particularly as it relates to the pollinators, our research shows that bee families, at least at the family level, have distinct floral preferences. And so we have four bee families here: Apidae, Helicoidae, Megachilidae, and Andrenidae. All unique bee families, full of different diversity within each family. And the data shows that each of these families has their own sort of suite of plant species that are most attractive to the members of that family. So Monarda fistulosa, Solidago nemoralis, Asclepias syriaca, and Oligeron rigidum. Another way of looking at the data to sort of guide plant selection. And we've also used this data to develop hypothetical seed mixes that can be developed to sort of maximize different goals in terms of the habitat management or habitat conservation efforts. And so these are two seed mixes, one created specifically to support overall bee abundance, so not really taking into consideration the diversity of bees, but just sheer abundance of pollinators attracted to that suit of plant species. And the other scenario, attracting the greatest number of species to the wildflower habitat. So abundance on the left, richness on the right. And one thing to point out with this work is that when doing this, we find that there are a number of plant species that sort of hit both of these design mixes. So we know that 9 out of 15 of these plant species that we studied are shared between these two goals of abundance and richness. And lastly, we recently published a paper in the Journal of Ecologia looking at the specific flower traits or plant traits that drive pollinator and natural enemy visitation. So the idea here being, we only studied 54 plant species that are found in the Great Lakes region, but of course this type of habitat work is being conducted across the United States. So in areas where this type of in-depth study hasn't been conducted. So what can we learn about these plant traits or plant species that actually drives these visitation patterns? And so we collected all of these plant traits: corolla width, pollen, height, area, color, number of flowers, week of peak bloom. And we related that to the different family level pollinators, as well as pollinators in terms of their functional diversity, whether or not they're a habitat specialist, their body size, things like that. And the numbers that you see on the left and on the right of the plant traits is basically the ranking of that plant trait, the importance of that plant trait in attracting, on the left, pollinators, and on the right, natural enemies. And so from this figure, we know that floral area is likely the most important plant trait in attracting the highest number of pollinators and natural enemies. But as you can tell, a lot of these plant traits are important in their own way, albeit to smaller groupings of bees. And this sort of reinforces that idea of incorporating a high level of plant diversity in the habitat. The more diversity you have at the species level, the more diversity you're going to have at the plant trait level, the more diversity in pollinators and natural enemies that you're going to attract to your planting. So that's all I have for the short presentation. If anyone is interested in talking more about any of the work that I've done, whether it be the study we did, designing seed mixes to attack these different priorities or these different goals, questions about specific plant species that they're interested in incorporating, and knowing what pollinators those plants are likely to attract, whether it's common species or rare species. I'm happy to have those conversations with anyone that's interested. So thank you. I'm guessing I don't have any time for questions, so if there's questions, write them in the chat and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Logan. That was a great presentation, and yes, that is the recommended approach. If you have questions for Logan, I've seen some come in the chat already. Keep those coming. And Logan, if you have the ability to kind of field those chat questions in the chat, that's great. Any questions that don't get answered, again, we will be trying to get everyone's questions answered and compile a Q&A that we'll send out to the group after the conclusion of the webinar. Next slide, yes. So our next speaker is Justin Meissen, who is going to be talking about more cost-effective and predictable outcomes in prairie reconstruction. Go ahead, Justin.
Okay, very good. Thanks. So I'm Justin Meissen. I'm the Restoration and Research Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. And today I'm going to talk about how different choices that we make when designing and implementing native revegetation projects, particularly with tallgrass prairies, how that can be improved with applied research. So to start off, I'd like to give a brief introduction to the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We're an organization based out of the University of Northern Iowa, and our mission is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. So the center was born out of Iowa's native roadside vegetation program back in the 90s, and since then it's grown in scope to multiple programs. And so the program I manage is the Research and Restoration program, where we focus on moving prairie restoration forward with applied science. Some of our other flagship programs are the Natural Selections program, which is focused on getting more native seeds on the commercial market. Then we have the Iowa Roadside Management program, where we support managing native vegetation on roadsides around the state. And then finally, we have our Prairie on Farms program, where the objective is to integrate prairie into agricultural landscapes. So when I talk to people working in Iowa, the Midwest, and even nationwide, a lot of people have sort of their own conception of the term prairie. So to some people, it means land with any kind of presence of tall grass. To others, it means a plant community with a very specific history and a list of plant species. So to make sure that we're all on the same page during this presentation, I'll be using a fairly broad definition here. So for our purposes, the prairie is going to be an open-grown mixed stand of native grasses and wildflowers. So to give you context to what I'll be referring to in general, because I know we're kind of all over the country, this map here shows the original extent of the kind of vegetation I'll be talking about, which is represented on the left by a photo of an original prairie remnant. So why would it be beneficial to integrate more prairie into the landscape? Well, a properly designed prairie planting can do a lot of really important things for us. And even more useful is that they do all these things at once, which is to say that native vegetation, prairie vegetation, is very multifunctional. So briefly to remind us of those functions, when it's strategically located, prairies help us keep nutrients from entering our waterways. They also help reduce flooding at the landscape scale, strategically placing prairies to intercept and uptake water. The dense vegetation below and above ground really helps manage that. They also provide sorely needed pollinator insect resources. Diverse prairies produce a lot of flowers for pollinators. And produces the habitat that a lot of our iconic species need to reproduce. Of course, the highlight these days is the monarch butterfly. So that's a big list of good things that prairies provide all at once. So people are seeing these potential benefits, and we're seeing more attempts at putting prairie or prairie-like vegetation back in the landscape. So in the past 5 years, we've seen a really significant number of conservation acres in these kinds of practices. Some of the most significant of them have been the Pollinator Habitat related. Prime example of that being USDA's Pollinator Habitat Initiative, which in that practice specifies long-lasting, high-quality meadows of native wildflowers, which you'll notice is a pretty close approximation of our prairie definition. And so this chart here shows how explosive that adoption of pollinator habitat was, at least in the Corn Belt. Recently, we've got other new popular conservation practices, prairie strips practice, which rolled out last year. And because this practice of planting strips of prairie within farm fields is easy to integrate and it's really flexible, I think it has a lot of potential to be widely adopted. And then another example is the Iowa Roadside Management Program, more of a long-standing program that utilizes and requires native vegetation, but in a right-of-way context along Iowa roadsides. Now, even as these prairie vegetation practices are being implemented on a really massive scale and are necessary at an even more massive scale to address the ecological issues we have in our landscapes, we still see fairly limited support for conservation programs. Additionally, with the potential for so many new adopters, the stakes are high to make sure that practitioners succeed on their first experience with prairie practices. So an initially positive experience is going to lead others to being more willing to adopt. So that creates a very challenging situation. How can we continue to achieve the necessary impact with fewer resources? In other words, how can we make these initiatives more cost-effective and reliably successful? So as conservation practices that use prairie-like vegetation become more mainstream, we need to make sure the practice is effective and efficient as possible. So when we're talking about a complex system like a diverse plant community, it can really be a challenge to sort out what works and why, because there's so many variables at play. But the basic research in restoration ecology is out there that shows us that the system is tractable. And that's why we need really applied research that can isolate and investigate the practices that improve the chances of successful implementation, maximize the ability of prairies to provide multiple ecological benefits at once, and improve the cost effectiveness. So when we have a solid understanding of those objectives, we can use our research results to inform recommendations for land managers. And then we have a good shot at really solving some of these conservation challenges if we start scaling up our integration of prairies in working lands. So at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, we're working to get that research done. One of the key strategies that we use to do this is to employ a combination of formal field experiments and demonstration sites or field trials to answer research questions. The field experiments take more thought and time to set up and carry out, but they provide that hard data to answer the questions in the detail that we need. Field trials and demo sites, on the other hand, are set up with our partner landowners to contrast different practices or concepts, and they're usually only replicated to a minimal extent, but they do give us the opportunity to see whether something is or isn't working. And another thing that we make sure to do when designing research is to use real-world equipment and techniques. So we use the kinds of equipment that would be used in the field, and ultimately that makes the research that we do more applicable to practice. So today I want to highlight some of these applied research projects we've worked on to show you how we've been making progress with prairie reconstruction research. First, we're going to look at a field trial and demonstration site, looking at the importance of matching seed mix to site conditions, and then a set of field experiments looking at some common prairie design, implementation, and establishment decisions, and how well our results hold up at different sites and planting years. So the first project I want to highlight looks at applying prairie to dry marginal lands and the importance of matching seed mix to site conditions. So most of our prairie research and recommendations are usually derived from typical medium soils, but of course soils on many project sites are either quite dry or quite wet. And so we looked at the dry end of the spectrum with this study. So with this project, we used field trials to figure out how prairie reconstruction performs on dry soils and what kinds of seed mixes work on those sites. You can find a more detailed report on our website, which is at the link here on the screen, and I'll put a link to in the chat as well later. So to answer these questions, we worked with several partners, including Pheasants Forever, County Roadside Manager, and a farmer owner-operator to establish field trials in northeastern Iowa. So we worked with the landowner to identify sort of the driest soils in one of his fields, and then looked at 2 seed mix treatments, seed mix with species adapted to poor dry soils, and a more generalized mesic prairie mix using species adapted to medium soils. And both of those were generated or based on mixes generated by the Tallgrass Prairie Center's seed mix calculator. So takeaways from that study was that key prairie species establish well even in dry conditions. So for example, most of the native warm and cool season grasses established well in marginal dry soils, along with important summer and fall flowering forbs. But seed mixes that were customized for the dry soils resulted in more ecological functionality and at a similar price when planted on the dry soil. So we found that the dry adapted forb species seem to establish better than their medium to wet soil counterparts, which resulted in more functional groups present. So for example, the entire spring forb functional group was missing from the non-customized mix in the first year. And then finally, cost effectiveness, thinking in terms of stems per dollar or flowers per dollar. So that cost effectiveness of prairie construction is roughly comparable in productive versus marginal soils. So, you know, productive soils do produce more stems per dollar, but it's less than a 40% difference compared to dry soils, at least in our study here. So the other project I'll highlight today real quick is a set of experiments where we're testing some common prairie design, implementation, and establishment decisions, namely how seed mix design, time of planting, and first year mowing influence establishment outcomes. And then we looked at which conclusions held up at different sites in different planting years to help us validate our research. So we did 2 field experiments. Planted one of them in 2015 in far northeastern Iowa, and one planted in 2018 in east central Iowa. The second experiment replicated the first one, so they shared the same treatments. So in both experiments, we looked at 3 seed mix treatments that reflect sort of a range of common seed mix approaches. So we planted a forb-dominated pollinator mix, which was high cost, a grass forb balanced diverse mix, which was moderate cost, and a grass-dominated economy mix, which was low cost. And then we also looked at a mowing treatment where we did either no mowing or we kept the stand mowed to 5 inches throughout the first year, which that ended up being 4 times, mowing basically monthly. And then it is an added treatment, which was not replicated among experiments, but was added in the second experiment. We looked at a planting season treatment, where we looked at a dormant planting time in November and a spring planting time in April. These were all drilled. So based on our preliminary data from 2 years, our results showed us that the conclusions that we derived from our previous experiments about seed mix design and first year mowing mostly held up at different sites and planting years. Some of the conclusions that held up best were that establishment mowing increased native stems, and in many ways also you get what you plant. So you get the most native stems in the grass dominated and balanced mixes, whereas you get the most flowers in the forb dominated mix. Then we found that the dormant season planting, so that was more cost effective at providing pollinator resources, and that from a cost per flower standpoint. So dormant season seeding was more cost effective than spring seeding. So we'll conclude things here by sort of summing up all the insights from each of these highlighted projects. You know, I think the key takeaway is that prairie construction is a tractable system, and applied prairie research really can help land managers achieve more ecological benefits from working lands in a more cost-effective way. We saw how sustained research can improve the chances of successful implementation of prairie reconstruction, showing how results are generally repeatable across sites and years, and that design and management decisions like first year mowing, selecting proper seed mixes for soils, and planting in dormant season can all help ensure successful outcomes. We also saw that by choosing a diverse seed mix with a balance of grass and forbs that matches the right plants with the right soils, that helps maximize the number of ecological benefits that prairie stands provide at once. So increased multifunctionality. And then ultimately, all these management and design choices we identified, they contribute to improving cost effectiveness by making sure the seeds that we buy and sow have the best chance at becoming productive plants. So with that, I'd like to thank our partners and funders. Great group of collaborators here. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but if you do have questions, throw them in the chat and I will try to answer them as we go along.
Thank you, Justin. Yes, and I will ask again, any questions about Justin's talk, please go ahead and put those in the chat. And we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Cheryl Daniels with Davey Research Group. Cheryl's going to be speaking about vegetative cover techniques. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Oh, there we go. Went too far now. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I work with Davey Resource Group, and Davey Resource Group works with clients on a diverse array of projects, including utility and urban forestry, assisting clients with meeting federal and state requirements for natural areas and restoration. And part of the restoration work we do includes selecting, installing, and maintaining native seed mixes. We also perform research-oriented work. Today I'm going to talk with you about one project in particular and some commonalities we're seeing when it comes to planting natives in the right-of-way, particularly on the DOT right-of-ways. The focus of my presentation will be evaluating vegetation cover. Oops, sorry, got to get used to the lag there. Okay, so we're going to be talking about work we do for the Ohio Department of Transportation, and they have a lot of opportunity for post-construction restoration products, post-construction restoration opportunities, rather. OHDOT has the 4th largest interstate highway system in the country. They manage 19,000 miles of roadside, comprising 260,000 acres. And since 2011, OHDOT has constructed 8,000 projects totaling $16.4 billion, and this illustrates a potential opportunity for native pollinator habitat. So, oops, sorry, skipped again. It's being a little jumpy on me. Okay, so one of the projects we're currently working on them are with OHDOT on is developing and evaluating post-construction ground cover that meets erosion and sediment goals and is beneficial to pollinators. DRG, Davey Resource Group, is researching seed mixes for various vegetation management zones along the right-of-way. For instance, we're looking at different mixes for the road edge, wet ditches, slopes, and the back of the fence line. So the area where it could grow a little bit longer without being a visibility issue for the traveling public. We're looking at different establishment and maintenance methods, and then we're also looking at updating OHDOT's specification for evaluating vegetation coverage. There are many factors that can affect vegetation success along roadsides. We have compacted soils that come from construction equipment and the road building process itself, which is meant to provide a hard subsurface for roads and to make sure there are not slips on the roadsides. High pH is caused from the calcium used in that process. Topsoil is stripped during the construction process, and the soil replaced before seeding is often of lower quality. High salt levels are caused by winter operations, which place salt and brine on the roads. And then, of course, there are disturbances from errant vehicles, which cause rutting and rip up seedlings getting established. While non-native species typically used in right-of-way situation are equipped to deal with these conditions, native species thrive in a natural environment without these added salts and a more neutral pH and areas that haven't been compacted so much by humans. Transitioning to natives can be difficult for those that are used to methods and techniques for turf seeding and maintenance. And if the traveling public is not informed of the changes in the goals, their expectations for the appearance of the right-of-way may not be met. So there's a variety of differences between native and non-native establishment and maintenance. Native species seed costs more, but seeding is at a lower rate than turf grass. So for example, you could have 10 pounds per acre for natives plus 30 pounds of cover crop compared to 300 pounds per acre for turf seed. Native species require less mulch. They typically don't germinate under more than 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of straw, fiber mulch, or soil. So you have to be mindful of how much you're using out there and be ready to make those changes. The seeding periods could be a little bit different too. While you could put species down, or you could put the native seed mixes down at any time, they're not really going to grow at any time of year. So you have to realize there's going to be maybe a longer dormancy period at different times of the year. So native species really starting to germinate and could be planted in the fall or the early spring, whereas the non-natives have a longer cycle that they might start to germinate, so they could be seeded more readily year-round. The root system growth and above ground growth varies between native and non-native species, as mentioned in a prior presentation. Due to the below ground growth of natives and the lower initial vegetation coverage above ground, natives take longer to provide above ground coverage. Native species grow extensive root systems prior to breaking ground, while non-native species growth above ground is similar to the root system growth. Non-native species germination rates are faster than native species. So for example, Kentucky bluegrass, a common non-native turf grass, will germinate within 14 to 30 days, whereas a comparable native grass, purple top, will take 30 to 50 days to germinate. So for the OHDOT ground cover project, we are looking at their evaluation methods that they're using for vegetation cover in their post-construction work. They have a goal of 70% vegetated ground cover, and ODOT's inspectors are just using overall visual observations of the sites to determine that percent cover. Their inspections include all vegetation for percent cover determination, so it could include invasives just as well as what was planted out there. So now that ODOT is starting to use natives in their ground cover mixes, the inspectors need more definitive ways of determining percent cover that's more appropriate for native species and non-natives alike. So for our project, we are doing field trials in 6 different locations around the state. And our methods are using a 1 by 1 meter sample for the vegetation surveys. And we take 2 surveys for every plot. We determine the percent cover of invasive versus non-invasive, cover of invasive versus non-invasive species at each site. And we're looking at every species that's growing to determine how well each seed is doing within each mix. And we're also determining the bare ground percent cover visually. We're using a standard hula hoop, which has an area of a 1 by 1 meter square for these evaluations. And determining percent cover is important because vegetation cover prevents erosion. EPA regulations require percent cover goals to be met before projects are accepted as complete and signed off. Plant coverage goals differ by state. In Ohio, for example, the Ohio EPA requires OHDOT to obtain 70% coverage within 6 to 12 months, whereas Maryland Department of Transportation's coverage is 95% within 12 months, and that's determined by the Maryland Department of the Environment. And PennDOT has a 70% coverage goal within 90 days, and that's determined by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So what's considered part of the percent cover? Well, the percent of site that's covered by vegetation. So vegetation cover can include cover crops, native species, invasive species, or non-native naturalized species such as turf grasses. Surveys can also include bare ground, litter, rocks. Should they include noxious and invasive weeds, cover crop, or maybe only what was planted? Some people include it all. So we're asking the question and trying to come up with some recommendations for the DOT. So current practice cover evaluations out there performed by some of the different DOTs are where OHDOT does visual inspections. Maryland is similar. Pennsylvania also does visual inspections for non-natives, but for natives, they require 9 seedlings per square foot. There are different assessment methods out there. The US EPA uses the North Carolina Vegetation Survey, commonly known as VIVI, which has 10 by 10 meter plots with subplots to do visual inspections. They require 70% coverage, and percent coverage is determined for individual species. The Forest Service does 5 to 10 plots per site. Plot sizes vary by site size to ensure 2 to 5% of the site is inspected. Data collected in the plots is averaged to determine the overall percent cover. And the USDA has a couple different methods. They use the line intercept method, the step point method, the point intercept method, and with the NRCS, they have a minimum requirement of 2.7 plants per square foot with a goal of 5 plants per square foot. Linear habitats can cause issues in completing surveys with the common assessment methods. Some sites can be around 20 feet wide, while transects generally are broken down into multiple lines. This can be an issue when the site is a mile long and only 20 foot wide, where only one line can be created. So the 1 meter square plot and transect methods work well in these linear right-of-ways. And we are looking to make determinations for the most effective way to evaluate percent cover along the right-of-ways. We're looking at whether different types of species, native versus naturalized or invasive, should be included in an assessment for final approval. We're looking at the slower germination rates of natives and the effect on percent cover approval, and also looking at which native and naturalized species can survive the roadside conditions. And I know we don't have a lot of time for questions. I'll do my best to answer in the chat, but if you have any questions or thoughts on the subject and what your entity is doing, please email me and a member of our team can get back with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl. And yes, please continue to ask questions in the chat. I also, one housekeeping item. There are a couple of you that have called in with phone numbers that we're trying to assign to breakout rooms. If you could chat Claudia privately, those one individual phone number 315-725-0338, and then also another 865-309-1645. Whomever that is, please again contact Claudia in the chat, and she will work to get you in the appropriate breakout. We also have a couple of other people that Claudia has asked that I mentioned. Adam Baker, Alexandria Beck, Andrew Alderet, Charlie Holt, and Sandy. I don't show a last name. If you could also privately chat Claudia so that she is able to put you in the appropriate breakout session. Thank you. All right, on to our next speaker, Erin Feggestad with Stantec. Erin's going to be discussing establishment and pollinator value for native seed mix at LaGrange Solar. Erin, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So just a quick intro to myself and kind of what I do. I'm an ecologist working out of Stantec's Madison, Wisconsin office, and I direct Stantec's ecosystem restoration design and implementation team in the Midwest. And I also have the opportunity to work on restoration projects throughout North America and actually beyond. And really one common theme in a lot of those is really the challenges of establishing native vegetation, especially in disturbed areas. So to address those challenges, I really like to take a practitioner standpoint, using lessons learned from implementing restoration projects in natural areas and built environments over many years, using anecdotal observations gained while monitoring and doing stewardship, from applying adaptive management, and then incorporating new technologies, demonstrations, and applied research into restoration. So the project I'll talk about today is a demonstration project. It's referred to as the LaGrange Solar Array. It's located about an hour's drive south of Atlanta in the southern Appalachian ecoregion of Georgia, just north of the coastal plain. And the project is a demonstration in several ways. First, it's demonstrating use of solar on DOT right-of-way. The project was developed by Southern Company and Georgia Power, which is a subsidiary of Southern Company, working in collaboration with the landowner, which is Georgia Department of Transportation, as well as the Ray C. Anderson Foundation and the Ray, which are both environmental nonprofits focused on sustainable, innovative, and safe highway systems. The project covers about 5 acres within an interchange of Interstate 85. It's producing about 1 megawatt of electricity. And along with providing interchange lighting and using emerging solar technologies, it's also a demonstration for pollinator habitat on solar on right-of-way. The site is situated between Interstate 85, the Interstate 85 off-ramp, and Highway Georgia 1. The solar array in the demonstration project is highlighted in green. The bottom right photo shows the site towards the end of construction. You can see Interstate 85 off in the distance there. And then the upper right photo shows the baseline conditions. It was typical right-of-way, mowed turf, volunteer weedy vegetation. You'll note some exposed soils. That's likely due to previous disturbance, perhaps lack of topsoil. These are generally nutrient poor, sandy loam type soils in this area. It's also a project that's demonstrating use of pollinator-friendly ground cover on solar sites. And so it's one of the first pollinator projects for Southern Company. It is the first for Georgia Power, and the project is being done in collaboration with Electric Power Research Institute as well. And I think it's a really fun project because in addition to showcasing the potential for pollinator habitat on solar, it is also allowing stakeholders to work through the whole process of habitat design and planning, from the actual habitat implementation, procurement of contractors, actually getting the design into the ground, the transition to operations and management and habitat stewardship, and use of monitoring and research to really inform lessons learned and future application at other sites. So on the use of pollinator-friendly vegetation, Southern Company and Georgia Power really asked two primary questions. One was around the use of pollinator-friendly native ground cover establishment in conjunction with initial soil erosion control prevention measures to meet permit standards. And so this really focuses on compliance. You know, first and foremost, this site, like other solar developments, like other construction projects, there's a regulatory requirement around soil stabilization and runoff. And so Georgia Power's goal was to establish vegetation as soon as possible following construction. And so our monitoring and research is really looking at, can this be done successfully using a native seed mix? And ultimately, can the native vegetation that is established be maintained relative to a typical non-native turf grass that would be used on a DOT right away? The second question is centered around seed mix design and compatibility of native pollinator-friendly vegetation with the solar infrastructure. And so the initial design parameters included an 18-inch maximum height for native plant selection. And that was basically the distance between the ground surface and the lower leading edge of the photovoltaic panels. And really the emphasis here is on reducing interference with the PV panels. Essentially, the goal is to not have any vegetation on or over the panels. And obviously, a lot of native vegetation has a mature height greater than 18 inches, so this is a really important factor to consider during native seed mix design. Although I will note there was some flexibility once the site was built and before the native habitat was installed. We looked at as-built conditions and were actually able to add some taller species because the 18 inches ended up being, the leading edge ended up being a little bit taller than 18 inches. And we asked a third question around pollinator habitat and usage of the sites by pollinators. And essentially we wanted to know for this type of site in this setting, will the native plantings boost pollinator habitat and pollinator usage in a new seeding relative to a traditional turf setting where native or non-native weedy vegetation is able to establish passively. So we established 2 vegetation treatments within the site, pollinator habitat area, which was revegetated with a native seed mix, and then a traditional vegetation area, which was revegetated with a traditional DOT non-native type turf grass. Both treatments in the end are equal in size, and they have similar previous land use and soils, similar effects from the soil from the solar infrastructure, and similar adjacent land use and edge effects. And I'll just note too, when it comes to the research aspects, the sizes and the locations of the treatment areas were essentially selected during the site design engineering. So it was done prior to research development. And really, since the emphasis was on compliance, on revegetation, we did not seek to do experiments with replicate plots, for example, looking at different site preparation techniques or different individual species or groups of plant species or stewardship techniques. So in the end, really the emphasis was on revegetation and observing the habitat outcomes that resulted. So a single native seed mix was designed for each treatment area. The native seed mix for the pollinator habitat area had to consist again of native low-growing species. We used 32 species total, 4 graminoids, which are grasses and sedges, and 28 wildflowers that were native to Georgia based on USDA plants and North American Plant Atlas records. Of those, 28 are perennial and 4 can be considered annual or short-lived perennials. We seeded at a rate of 95 seeds per square foot. of those, about 85% of those seeds are perennial and 15% were the annual or short-lived species. And we seeded at a rate of about 30% graminoids to 70% wildflowers versus the traditional vegetation area, which was again a kind of a typical DOT contractor mix of non-native cool season grasses along with an annual rye cover crop. And I'll just make a quick note too on preparation. Both treatment areas did receive some form of pre-seeding site treatment. Prior to the solar construction, there was shallow disking and some soil amendments. That was to reduce compaction and to increase some nutrients. And then following construction, the traditional vegetation area was seeded immediately after construction. The pollinator habitat area, there was a delay. There was some use of some cover crops during the construction for compliance. So we did a round of herbicide to remove that vegetation, then some additional soil preparation to reduce compaction. So the pollinator habitat area was actually seeded. It was actually in May 2020, about 4 or 5 months after construction. So we're also interested in how the native seed mix establishes given really the sharp gradients in light and moisture that is created by PV panels. So we stratified the vegetation treatments by light treatment, and this resulted in 4 strata for sampling: a pollinator sun, a pollinator shade, a traditional sun, and a traditional shade treatment. We overlaid a grid on the 4 strata using a GIS tool. The grid cells were equal to the size of 1 PV panel. The grid cells were labeled, and then we randomly selected samples using a table of random digits to select random samples. In the field, the sampling grid cells were located with a GPS, and we sampled in 1/4 square meter quadrats in all 4 strata. Recorded species to recorded plants to species level. We recorded percent cover based on ocular estimates. We recorded if a plant exceeded the height restriction of 18 inches at any time. Then we noted if a species was flowering within the quadrat. In 2020, sampling was not done until August because there was a grow-in period. It was repeated in September. I'll just note too that 2020 represents the first year of up to 5 years of sampling. And then our statistical analysis was done using our software to compare the treatments. We use the Xerces Society Streamlined Bee Monitoring Protocol to gather data on pollinator usage within each vegetation treatment. So that essentially consisted of establishing transects between the photovoltaic panel rows in the sunny areas in both vegetation treatments. So we tried to buffer a little bit off the edge of each treatment area, and then place the transects in alternating rows to have some separation. Following that protocol, plants within 3 feet of each side of the transect were observed and pollinators were recorded. And we recorded by major functional group, and those are listed on the right here. So we split bees up into several groups, and then we also recorded butterflies and moths, wasps, whether predatory or parasitic, lady beetles, and then syrphid flies. And all pollinator data is from field observations. We didn't collect any specimens for later verification. So our very early takeaways, again, we did the 2 months of the monitoring in the first year. So this is the very early findings from this study, and this will continue for up to another 4 years. So on the first question of ground cover establishment for soil erosion prevention, our goal was 30% cover within 3 months of seeding. In the case of the pollinator habitat area, that would have been about 5 or 6 months after the construction. And what we found is based on absolute cover values and looking at both vegetation treatments, is that neither actually met the 70% standard. They came close, but they didn't get to the true 70%. There's actually no difference between the treatments, between the traditional vegetation turf area and between the pollinator habitat area. And we attribute that to a couple of things. First and foremost, again, keeping in mind these are very disturbed soils, so it's going to take some time for things to grow in. You can see it in both photos here that there's some patches of bare ground. The traditional vegetation area was often mowed. Once the vegetation reached the bottom height of the panel, there was mowing done. The pollinator habitat area was mowed one time between the August and September event. And I'll just note too that erosion control BMPs were maintained throughout the establishment period, and between that and by the end of the season, there was a permit sign off. On the second question of pollinator-friendly ground cover establishment with a height restriction of 18 inches. What we were really interested in the first year was native seed establishment, especially on bare soils that are really subject to a lot of competition from non-native and native weedy species. And so we think, generally what I look for as a practitioner is that we see a moderate level of germination in the first year as a predictor of potential future success. And what we found is that 14 of the 32 species germinated from the seed mix within 3 months of installation. 13 of those were observed in the sun treatment, 14 in the shade. Of those, 10 were perennials and 4 were annuals and short-lived perennials. And we saw 5 of the species germinate and flower by the end of September. Overall, the seeded species contributed about 40% relative cover across the 2020 monitoring period. And the seeded natives were pretty widely spread throughout the pollinator habitat area. They occurred in 55% of all of our 2020 plots. And only one of the seeded species, a grass or a split blue stem, exceeded 18 inches in height. So at least in the first year, we're pretty successful in designing the seed mix to keep vegetation below the height of the panels. When we look at a breakdown of relative cover values for all the species that were observed, what really jumped out and was seen as a beneficial for early use by pollinators was the presence of seeded annual and short-lived perennial species, and particularly the 4 at right here: Plains coreopsis, sensitive partridge pea, lemon bee balm, and Indian blanket. They represented about 26% relative cover in that first season. Of the other 10 or so species that germinated, those were all perennial, and they represented only about 12.4% cover, or about 1% cover each. As expected on our first year planting, we did have a lot of non-native plants. Most of that was from southern crabgrass, which is an annual sun-loving weed. A lot of that occurred between the panel rows and sunny areas. And we did note 8 invasive species. Overall, low frequency and low cover, but they were present the first year. When it comes to panel effects, again, this is first year data, so we have to interpret this with a grain of salt because the plant community is still developing. But in that first year, as far as overall plant richness, we found no significant interaction between light treatment and total plant richness and native species richness. Basically, there was no difference between those areas, but there was a difference when it came to non-native species, and we saw more of those in the sun treatment. That's to be expected, I think. Those areas are going to likely recruit more of the weedy generalist species. In this case, that again was southern crabgrass. When it came to flowering and plants greater than 18 inches in height, we saw the highest frequency again in the pollinator habitat in the sun areas. And on the third question on the pollinator habitat establishment and use by pollinators, I just summarized here basically our species richness data. And both areas were really effective at actually recruiting weedy native and non-native vegetation from the soil seed bank. So we observed 63 total plant species in the pollinator habitat area and about 47 in the traditional vegetation area. In the traditional vegetation area, that included 31 native species that were not seeded. Really the difference between the two areas, and especially the native species richness, is entirely contributed to the native seeding that occurred. So we saw more wildflowers in the pollinator habitat area, to be expected again because of the seeding and also because of the higher frequency of flowering plants. The traditional vegetation area, because it was mowed flowering either occurred for a short period of time before mowing, or it only occurred by species that were tolerant of regular mowing, like clovers. And a pollinator usage, again, very preliminary data here, but seed mix had a significant effect on the abundance of pollinators. Significantly more pollinator usage in the pollinator habitat area. We saw about 80% of all pollinators observed within the site were observed within the pollinator habitat area. That included 85% of all bees, 76% of all butterflies and moths, 84% of all predatory wasps, and then just a few observations of the other groups. And it's worth noting too, all bumblebees were observed in the pollinator habitat area, even though the traditional vegetation area theoretically had habitat, for example, by low flowering clovers. And one really good surprise at the end of the year, we observed no monarchs during our monitoring, but we did observe a monarch over-depositing on a butterfly milkweed at the end of the monitoring period. So just some year one takeaways. These are important ones for me and kind of setting the stage for moving forward. Number one is flexibility. In year one, have a plan, but be willing to adapt. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we had as-built data that allowed us to justify an increase in the native plant height tolerance and to eventually lead to a higher seed mix diversity. We had to change plans around seeding timing and do some additional seed bed preparation to get the native seeding in particular on a path towards potential success in the future. In the Southeast United States, there are not a lot of commercial native seed vendors, so we had to expand our native seed search criteria as well. So that was a bit challenging. As far as vegetation indicators, as a practitioner, what I'm always really interested in is what can early monitoring tell us about potential future success? You know, we like to see on some level annuals and short-lived perennials providing early flowering cover, but we want those to be replaced by perennial species. So we'll ask the question, are annuals and short-lived perennials, the fact that they germinated, is that an indicator of overall seeding success? And how will those slower growing or longer term perennials fare in future years? Will they eventually replace those annuals? We saw success in milkweed germination. All three germinated: butterfly milkweed, world milkweed, and antelope milkweed. And you know, like I mentioned, we did encounter invasive species. There was management in the form of mowing one time to reduce the stature of those, and then one species, Johnson's grass, was actually managed specifically. Then on the pollinator usage front, it's the old adage, if you build it, they will come. We saw 118% more pollinators in the pollinator habitat area. We saw species in 10 of the 12 pollinator groups that we monitored in the pollinator habitat area compared to 7 of 12 in the traditional vegetation area. And that is it.
Aaron, thank you. That was a really great presentation. I don't think we have any time for questions right now. So we're going to go ahead and break up into our breakout sessions. And each breakout session will have a different kind of set of questions to be discussing. So we'll go ahead and see if we can be successful in getting everyone into their breakout session. And thank you everyone for doing such a great job of answering questions in the chat.
Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully had good discussions. We popped in a couple of the breakouts and there were some good discussions going back and forth.
Yeah. I think we had a good discussion in our section, Iris.
Great. And Ashley, were you going to walk us through the report out?
I guess I certainly can.
Or Claire, sorry.
So, no, that's okay. So we had 4 different breakout sessions, and what we were going to kind of do was ask the leads for each of So we had multiple breakouts per topic. So I'm going to ask the leads for the transitioning to natives. If someone would be brave enough, one of the leads, to kind of get us started, tell us what your key challenges were, what your research ideas that emerged from your conversation, and the other breakout leads can maybe just join in if you have something new to add.
Tom was taking notes in our transitioning to native vegetation. You want to just kind of tick through those, Tom? Well, this is Chris. While he pulls those up, we heard a lot of, in terms of research needs, this need for more case studies to validate these challenges on a state-by-state basis. That came up, whether the Georgia example is an excellent example, but going to a different state, some of the Ohio work was interesting too, but we need that more broadly to help inform the decisions that are getting made. So that was one of the kind of research needs. In terms of challenges, we heard a number of different challenges. A colleague from Mississippi talked about just the pace of change, and when we change mowing regimes from 6 or 7 times a year to once or twice a year, you're talking about somebody's job that you're changing or potentially eliminating, and so there's going to be pushback. And so recognizing how you address that, I thought was a really good insight.
Hey, Chris, I was on mute there when I started. But a couple of other things that came up in our group was the slowness of government agencies to change their current policies and practices. And then there was also a lot of talk about at solar facilities, finding enough of the low growing plant species that wouldn't be incompatible with the height of the panels.
Do we have other research needs that were mentioned?
The other thing that came up was possibly studying carbon sequestration benefits.
Right. And maintenance regimes too, and different maintenance regimes on sites. We are looking at seeding and the installation part, but over time, the 3-5 year maintenance approaches.
Is there any additional, thank you guys, that's a great start. Do any of the other breakout groups have anything to add? Anything different, any different research gaps or needs?
I think we were all blended into one group.
Oh, okay, my mistake.
No problem.
So, well, okay. Well, thank you guys. Those were really great, great research suggestions. I've heard a lot also from our utility members about that long-term research or maintenance, like the 3 to 5 years. What are the best maintenance practices for long-term maintenance of pollinator habitat? And also just that seed mix design and what are those low-growing species that are going to perform and establish well. So I think those are really good research questions that emerged from your group that I've heard also from other utilities that are doing pollinator solar or thinking about pollinator solar. So do we maybe want to go on to our next breakout topic and hear problems and challenges you guys were having as well as your research needs? So tailoring seed mix designs. And I know, Logan, you were a breakout lead. Can I maybe get a report out from your group?
This is Logan. You can, but I did not take the notes, so maybe Christine.
So I have the notes. Can you guys hear me? This is Chris.
Yes, yes, we can. Okay, great.
So we got halfway through the list. The first question was, how do we balance pollinator value and cost effectiveness when designing seed mixes? And somebody, Kevin, came up with a really interesting approach that they're taking. He works for a utility company. So this is for utility corridors. And he said they don't put a specified seed mix in the contract documents. What they do is they say, we want so many plants that have this flowering color, so many that are this height, so many that bloom in this season, and we put they put a percentage of what they want, and of course everything needs to be native, and they allow the contractor to come up with the mix, and that way it's what the contractor can get and what is reasonably what costs a reasonable amount at that particular time. And the example that he gave was Plains coreopsis. He said, normally they don't have a problem with the seed, with getting seed for it, and it's a reasonably cost seed. But in the last couple of years, the seed was like 3 times more than normal. So that would be then a seed that whoever was the contractor on a contract during that period, they wouldn't have selected because it was so, for whatever reason, so much more expensive. Yep. So he called it a buffet approach, and we all thought that was really, really interesting.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah.
Go
ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, any like research ideas that you're like, this is the one, this is the top of our list. Yes, Logan indicated that there needs to be a cost effectiveness dollar value threshold, and that somebody needs to go out and say, okay, here's a mix that is reasonably that costs a reasonable amount, but that will be effective in attracting pollinators to your site. And so there was that research need that was identified. Okay.
Logan also indicated that you really didn't need to have a lot of diversity to get the kind of bees that you're trying to recruit. And he made the distinction between getting an abundance of pollinators versus getting the specialist pollinators, and that there was a real need to determine at the beginning of the project what the goals were for attracting pollinators. Are you trying to attract specialist pollinators, or are you just trying to get as many pollinators to your site as possible?
Okay, so kind of an evaluation of seed mixes, trying to find the sweet spot for attracting the most number of pollinators that you can at the most kind of economical cost. Did I get that? Did I capture that about right? Logan,
I think so, yeah.
Me a thumbs up. Okay, great. I think I've had similar conversations, Logan, with Rufus. So, all right. Any other research questions that came from your group or another group that was talking about tailoring seed mixes? And Iris, I'm thinking we probably didn't leave enough time for this part of our webinar.
Real quick, and I'll be quick with this, Ashley. I was just going to say, I think one thing that came up is for proper establishment, focusing in on how can specifications and contracting methods with the appropriate post-seeding establishment stewardship, how can that best work together? And you and I are working on that as it might appear anyway.
Yes, so looking at the seed mix establishment and best kind of maintenance practices for the establishment of those seed mixes. Did I restate that correctly, Kevin?
Yeah, and how can we incorporate those lessons into specifications and contract document?
Okay, I missed the contracting piece. Okay.
And then we can jump in and add to that in terms of challenges, is just the availability of both native seed and native plants projects, and then also the challenge of the costs of native species, especially some specialty species such as milkweed for monarchs.
Mm-hmm.
In line with that, research needs was maybe we need to conduct some research to be able to provide and inform native seed growers and native seed vendors on specific species that are of interest across various sectors. And then looking into, bottom line costs of both implementing and habitat management over the course of the lifetime of a project or development.
I think I missed that last part. Can you say that again?
Sure. Looking into the cost of both implementing and then managing habitat over the course of lifetime of a project, whether it be a roadside, a solar development, and so forth. Knowing that the upfront costs are so high, we have the assumption that the cost of management will decrease over time. Do we have any hardline numbers to back up those?
Yep. So that's a question that we're looking at EPRI, is kind of that, what do we need to do in the short term to really get that native habitat to establish, and then trying to track some of those long-term maintenance costs. Because that's always a question we hear. We need data on that. We need to do a better job of making a business case from transitioning. So I think that's a common need that a common research need I've heard. Okay, you guys, we are, we're running out of time. Site preparation. I was one of the team leads for site preparation. So some of the key challenges in my group that we talked about, of course, no one's going to be surprised to hear that weeds came up as an issue in site preparation, and how many herbicide applications do you really need for site preparation. We also kind of talked about some challenges being soil amendments, and when to use soil amendments and which soil amendments to use. Another challenge was really, how do you do a good job of getting ground cover establishment, and what kind of ground cover can reduce your costs? And again, that was kind of one of the goals of the LaGrange solar project that you heard Aaron talk about. For some of we kind of ran out of time talking about key research needs, but a couple that came up were different kind of site preparation strategies. So again, how to control weeds. Do we want to disc? Do we want to use herbicides? What's the right combination to use? And one that came up that was kind of new to me was better carriers. If you're doing broadcasting, looking at different carriers to get to broadcast that seed. I think we had 2 site preparation breakout groups. Does the other group have anything to add? Did you guys come up with anything different?
Yeah, there was one thing that we came up with. Laura Nagy brought up regional protocols. We've got a lot of protocols and information from the Southeast, but a lot of those don't carry over to the arid West. We need more information there.
Okay.
Another topic that was brought up was fire risk. How do you deal with fire risk associated with these establishing the vegetation? Are there better mixes of vegetation to help with that? And Laura also brought up landscape scale. Laura, do you want to elaborate on that? You had a question about that. Okay.
Okay, well, maybe we'll get a chat comment, or Laura can come back and maybe give us what she was thinking for that.
That's right. That's good.
Okay. Thank you, Hill. Okay, our last group, and I know we had several breakout groups on establishment and maintenance. Does someone want to go first for this breakout group?
Hey, Ashley, this is Claire. I can go ahead and jump in. I did just put some things in the chat. I wasn't sure if we were going to make it. But our group really, we talked a lot about site prep, actually, from an establishment perspective, and challenges related to what should I do from a site prep perspective, depending on what my current land use type is or previous land use type. So if you've had something that's been in ag for 50 or more years, that might look a little bit different than something that's, was a forested habitat that was just cleared, and, maybe a solar facility or other type of, whether a right of way or something is going to be put in. We also talked about invasive species control strategies and, you know, guides to really better understand how to manage certain invasives, and then also tools to help understand practitioners of, well, even though this is an invasive, should I really manage it? If it does provide some type of ecosystem service or benefit versus whatever the surrounding habitat type is, maybe it's better to not manage it as heavily or remove it. And then finally, some habitat prioritization models. There are some tools out there that do exist that, you know, practitioners can use to prioritize where it might best be suitable to incorporate a pollinator-friendly vegetation area, but it's often too large of a scale, right? So, or too small of a scale. So something, additional research or tools to help kind of drill that down to something that, you know, is more of a, hey, it looks like I should plant on this particular right-of-way in this particular, you know, part of my service area, as opposed to, you know, something larger.
Okay, so you need a more fine-scaled tool to help you really target exactly where in your utility or right-of-way you should be planting. Okay.
And I think, Tyler, you were trying to jump in earlier. Feel free if you have anything else to add.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, sorry I cut you off. I think our challenges were with staff not following the management plan, so going out and mowing or maybe applying herbicides, but also responding to the public's complaints about what the site looks like, because a lot of folks don't appreciate what pollinator or native habitat looks like, and so they might think that there are different pests or it attracts wildlife that's concerning and whatnot, and so potentially maintenance staff reacting to that and just going and mowing the whole site out of season or you know, at a time where it could be critical to pollinators. And then also just yeah, I mean, talking about training staff, and then also signage for the public or different approaches to that. And then John led the research part. So I don't know, John, if you want to jump in, or I took notes, so I'll follow your lead.
Well, we were talking a little bit about some training opportunities, perhaps. Is that what you were talking about, Tyler? Yeah, so both internal training for our for maintenance staff so that they understand the value, but also opportunities to be reaching out to the public because we heard about public pushback against leaving some of these areas so that they start to look maybe a little overgrown to what they're used to with a more, you know, turf grass type management plan. So those were a couple of the areas that we were thinking that there might be some opportunities.
All right, great. Does anyone else from any of the other breakouts have anything to add to what we've heard Claire, Tyler, and John talk on?
Sure, this is Cheryl, and yeah, we did talk about mowing challenges around the perception of what it looks like, and then equipment and just timing, getting that around where it needs to be, you know, just changing the course and of the direction as it's slow moving. As far as research needed, different nurse crops and rates they should be applied at, native annual and biennials that can fill the gap during early succession, equipment challenges, hydroseeding with natives, and then long-term maintenance would be perhaps burning as a maintenance practice. And seems like that is something where some people allow for it, others don't. So kind of getting over that hurdle and getting people comfortable with it, if it's something they should do, and where it's maybe appropriate or not appropriate. And then long-term maintenance reductions by use of natives.
So Cheryl, I missed the comment about the hydro seeding. What was that one?
Sure. Just, you know, how effective has it been for people who've been doing it? That sort of thing. It just seems like maybe natives haven't been hydro seeded that much.
So some tests, maybe some tests or demonstrations with hydro seeding under different conditions, and how effective is it compared to other seeding techniques. So that actually came up in our, very briefly in our session 2, was just kind of comparing different types of seeding techniques from hydro seeding, drilling, and broadcasting. Anything else from the maintenance breakout?
I mentioned a couple of things in chat. I know we're interested in research, and so how to capitalize on adjacent intensively managed areas, and research on natural recruitment, and kind of how to spread the footprint further after you put a lot into one area. Is there a way to extend that in a cost-efficient and effective way, and then just making seeds more readily and easily available at the local level, because a lot of them are hard to get your hands on. So those were the 2 final things I had. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Really quickly, you guys were over. Thanks everyone for hanging on. We're going to have 3 more webinars. One is going to focus on rights-of-way on pollinator habitat, the other on establishing milkweed and monitoring, and then the last one is going to be on solar power and pollinators. And Iris, I wanted to toss it back to you for a last word.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you all. You're the hardcore ones hanging on after the 4 o'clock hour. So thank you for sticking around. And it sounds like there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest around these discussions. So that's really exciting to see. As Ashley said, we do have these upcoming webinars. They'll be probably a very similar format. So looking forward to your participation there. I want to especially thank our presenters today at the beginning for sharing their research. That was really helpful for setting up some great discussions. Our facilitators for the breakout sessions, and just a note, again, as a facilitator, if you can send any notes to Ashley and Claire and myself and Caroline, that would be great. We'll be taking those notes and reviewing them for future. And then lastly, I'm going to drop in a link in the chat box. We'll also email this out, but this is just a very quick survey. I think 4 or 5 questions. We'd like your input. That'll help us as we're planning the next series of webinars. So thanks again, everyone. Happy to have you involved today, and we hope to see you at the next event.